out of your experience, and clearly your business model is to partner directly with the banks, and was curious what are some of your war stories there?
Yeah, I think, going back to what you said earlier about 5 years ago, no banks were really interested in working with tech companies. I think it was also kind of the other way around too, where if you talk to a fintech, somebody like in this room 5 years ago, everyone would say, why would we work with the banks? We can just do it ourselves, and we can go faster, and we can do it better. And so there was almost no willingness on either side. And I remember we were getting a lot of pressure early on from our investors even to go and be a full stack fintech company, but it depends on the space, right? In our case, as a mortgage company, mortgage is a relatively commoditized product. It's at its core. It's something the government is backing in a lot of cases, and it's a fairly commoditized thing. And so those players with the biggest reach and distribution, marketing, sales, will ultimately have great distribution for a company like us. Like, we don't need to go out there and reinvent all those things. And so for me, it comes down to focus. We were able to focus and build something that could be used by financial institutions from the very get-go. And by having that level of focus on something that can be used for the financial institutions, it's been a competitive advantage for us.
Given that you've seen probably a ton of different fintech companies come through your door, I'm just curious if you've seen any patterns in terms of their approach to the market, what they've done right, what they've done wrong. So from your perspective on the other side of the table, what wisdom can you bestow on our audience here?
Absolutely. I would talk about essentially two major things. One of them is around the importance of being distinctive and single-minded on a product that is, very focused, as Nima was mentioning, that can deliver very unique value. And then secondly, to be very much enterprise ready. And there's elements there around your internal processes, but also in terms of the sales approach.
What are you seeing in terms of traction right now? What areas are people having success in financial institutions, and how do you see that changing or evolving in the future?
Yeah, I think in terms of financial services, there's probably two ways of looking at it. One, you can sort of compete in the sort of the front end. So front end meaning user customer experience, brand, and the likes. And the second part of it is really competing on the back end. Back end meaning, whether it's, the cost, pricing, cost per ticket, etc. So between these sort of two tiers, you're sort of working with fintechs and third parties. And most of the traction that we are seeing is in companies where typically banks have been very good at, servicing the back end, helped by the regulation. So cost per ticket and usually, API integration, particularly with the legacy systems, banks have been very good at sort of servicing and maintaining customer journey through that, but not very good at the front end piece. The front end piece being the customer journey piece. So I think any company or fintech that's helping collaborate in that space is certainly getting traction. If you think about any other industry which has been disrupted, it's been typically because of one or two elements. Whether you take, for example, the printing industry, or you take the various other industries in terms of, or music industry, for example. But when it comes to banking industry, it's typically the data and the customer relationship. So anywhere we are able to capitalize on that, both the customer relationship and the data piece, we are certainly in a very prime position to actually build that platform of service. I think that's certainly is the case in certain aspects.
I think that, just a quick note on that too, just when you talk about banking as a service, when you look at the infrastructure, I'll talk about from like the sell side IT infrastructure, it's like 75% of that is non-differentiating. 75% of that. And so that's the same sort of thing from the banking side as well. And so being able to have something like a banking as a service, I think is incredibly positive. But again, it depends on what field. It's a very niche area, but I think it would be amazing. I haven't seen enough traction in there, but it's a wonderful way to have sort of another revenue stream for banks as the tide shifts around transactional revenue.
Yeah, I think regulation and PSD2 or many other things, actually I see it as very much an opportunity because I made the distinction earlier, just in the earlier discussion about, data and customer relationship being the key sort of part that sort of kept the banking industry going for in excess of 250 years collectively, right? But regulation is actually helping us to start to think about new and evolving business models. So when we're thinking about open API or PSD2, yes, whilst we have to share some of the transactional data, equally we're getting some enhanced and enriched data. That 80% of the data that is currently available in the industry has been created just in the last 2 years. So that's, quite a starking thing. It's not been there before. So we really have to reinvent ourselves and think about, how do we build new product, new solutions? How do we build new business models on top of the data that we currently have? So I think it's very interesting that the regulation is really forcing us and pushing us in that direction.
What does FinTech look like? What does the financial services industry look like in 10 years? Do we all have 20 apps on our phones? Do we only have one? Like, who do we go to for our financial services? Is it fragmented? I don't know what direction, but would love to hear your thoughts, Nima, on how you think things play out from the consumer's perspective. And
sure,
what that means for partnerships.
From a consumer's perspective, we see that there's a lot of friction in being involved in financial services, whether it's getting a mortgage, which I know is painful. I'm going through it right now with a few banks for my potential house, or it's opening an account. We had one bank that showed up to open accounts for us, and they showed up with a stack of papers. Basically, there's all of this, I'll call it mechanical work, that's forced to be done because the technology industry has historically ignored financial services. And I don't mean completely, I mean sort of Silicon Valley. You don't see people leaving Stanford and saying, man, I really want to go and start a FinTech, or at least you didn't 5 years ago. And now I think you do. This room is sort of evidence of that to some extent. And so the fact that people are starting to care about the technology and financial services is a really big deal. And how I think it ultimately manifests is you're going to have a one-click mortgage. You're going to have a one-click, pretty much any one tap. I shouldn't even say one click because people will be using mobile devices. You're going to have one tap, pretty much any product that you want as a consumer, and it becomes then more about buying. And how do you figure out, how does the bank or the lender or whoever it is help you figure out, and maybe yourself through self-education, help you figure out what's the right thing for you, and then the friction's going to be gone. The friction's going to be gone from the ecosystem. It's going to be transparency across players, and I think eventually you'll get to that one-tap ecosystem that's more about making the right decisions than about going through the motions.
AI, you'll have aggregation of data, maybe you'll have open API economies where, and does this open the door for a mega player to come in, like a Google, a Facebook, an Amazon? If you read the tech crunches of the world, just a matter of time until they come in and steal all the business. Is that something that anyone on this panel worries about in the future as you kind of open things up?
I think we should absolutely be cognizant of that because what they have is they have built the trust. I think trust is really important, and you have millennials, I'll throw that word out there, you have the millennials that absolutely trust the Apples of the world and the Googles of the world. And there's no question that they could do it. It's whether they want to do it and enter that space. But it's, I think even that, collaborating with them to help them do it is not a bad way to go to.
Yeah, I think China has demonstrated that the possibilities for tech platforms to become very meaningful financial services players is there. So I think that the threat is very real.
It's real to you. Okay.
And I tend to agree actually, because if I think about banks, starting point is always about collaboration. So that's almost a given. And then it comes down to, do you compete or do you cooperate? It comes down to the strength of the customer relationship and how fearful you are of losing that. Because we know in an ecosystem play, whoever owns that customer relationship is the most powerful one, right? So everybody else becomes pretty much a commoditized product. So that's why I think it's going to be quite key. So that's why banks typically fear the GAFAs of the world, because the Google, Amazon, Facebook of the world, they do have the deep relationships. Typically on average, a person spends about an hour on Facebook.
Yeah.
So, I think that is a part, I think, that is going to be quite critical in terms of the wage of war, in terms of whether it's between fintechs or whether it's banks or whether it's Google or Amazon, Facebook of the world, is going to boil down to, who owns the customer relationship.